David didn't realize his porch light had exploded until the screaming started. Not the sound of the wind, but the sound of his neighbor's standard suburban home being torn apart by the historic blizzard. He scrambled across the dark, ice-coated floor of his living room, fighting the immense pressure pressing against his windows. Outside, the world was a roaring, blinding chaos. A massive maple tree, which had stood for 80 years, fell across the road, blocking any chance of escape. Panic was a physical weight now, crushing the air in the small cul-de-sac. David squinted through the sliver of condensation he wiped from the glass. Amidst the chaos of splintered wood and flying debris, the small, ridiculed structure, the strange cabin built from heavy, unprocessed logs, stood absolutely silent and intact. The cabin, known locally as the Bunker or Agnes Folly, was where Agnes Thorne lived, and currently, where she waited. The air inside was heavy, smelling faintly of dry cedar and the acrid smoke from the cast-iron stove. Agnes sat on the edge of a worn leather chair, motionless. Her movements were always economical, her body lean and perpetually braced, as if expecting a sudden shift in the earth. The thick log walls, nearly a foot deep, muffled the hurricane outside into a manageable growl, but the isolation was absolute. She wasn't built for company. Agnes had built this cabin with her own hands, brick by difficult brick, log by painful log. It was less a house and more a fortress against the unpredictable world. On the plank floor beside her chair, a small polished brass compass lay face up. It was a military-issue piece, its glass cracked, its needle perpetually stuck, pointing northwest, a meaningless direction now. She didn't look at it, but she knew it was there. It was one of the few items she hadn't tossed when she moved here. Far from the city, and far from any easy route back. Her gaze drifted to the window, a small, heavily framed opening that provided a distorted view of the whirling snow. Beyond the glass, the manicured lawns of her neighbors had vanished under the drifts. Her neighbors, David and Sarah, who had laughed openly at her choice of materials, preferring their lightweight, mass-produced homes that promised quick mortgages and quicker appreciation. Agnes preferred permanence. Permanence meant control. She rose slowly, her joints protesting the cold that even the robust stove couldn't fully banish. She moved to the workbench, running her gloved hand over the smooth, sanded surface of a half-finished birdhouse. It was a ridiculous project for a woman like her, something decorative, gentle. She stopped working on it weeks ago. The silence of the cabin pressed in, interrupted only by the creak of the logs settling under the extreme temperature drop. Agnes picked up a sharp chisel, testing its edge. There was a dull, persistent ache in her chest, a familiar residue of a time when security was a lie and promises evaporated like steam. She tightened her grip on the tool. She was safe, yes, but being safe often meant being utterly alone. The wind howled its loudest, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the earth. Agnes heard the frantic, desperate knock just as a section of her chimney flue rattled loose. It was weak, almost swallowed by the storm, but unmistakable. She moved to the massive oak door, hesitating only a second. This was the moment the fortress failed, the moment the outside world demanded entry. She pulled the heavy latch. The door groaned open against the snowdrift, revealing Sarah, David's wife, bundled in an oversized parka, her face streaked with tears and wet snow. Clutched against Sarah's side, quiet but wide-eyed, was a boy of about 6, Ethan. "Agnes," Sarah managed, her voice ragged, We need help. Our roof. It's gone. David is trying to clear the north side, but the house is freezing. We can't keep the heat." Sarah wasn't hysterical, just tired and overwhelmed by the reality of their situation. She wasn't pleading for charity. She was stating a fact and accepting the risk of asking Agnes, the neighborhood outsider, for refuge. Agnes merely nodded, not offering comfort or false warmth. Her kindness was practical. "Come in," Shake the snow outside. Don't track it in." Ethan, the boy, slipped past his mother first. He wasn't whining or scared, he was observing. His eyes were drawn immediately to the deep, scarred logs of the interior walls, then to the massive stone fireplace. He didn't speak. He simply stood, absorbing the solidity of the place that mocked the fragility of their own home. Sarah leaned against the door to shove it closed, sighing deeply once the latch clicked securely. "Thank you, Agnes. We had nowhere else." "Get that coat off the boy," Agnes instructed. Already moving toward the stove, she pulled a large cast-iron kettle, its surface blackened with years of use, and filled it with water. "The floor is cold. Sit by the fire. I have soup, but it needs heating." She didn't ask what happened to their roof or offer sympathy for their loss. She acted. Her movements were slow, deliberate, efficient. She found a thick, heavy wool blanket, a military surplus item, and tossed it onto the hearth without looking at them. Ethan immediately crawled under it, burrowing into the unexpected warmth. Sarah sat beside him, running a hand through his damp hair, her expression easing into a weary relief. For Agnes, this was not an act of saving, but an act of maintaining order in a world gone sideways. A moment of quiet settled in, broken only by the hiss of the developing steam. Ethan looked up at Agnes, who was now stirring the soup pot with a wooden spoon, her face grimly set. "Your house doesn't shake," Ethan whispered, his small voice echoing slightly in the large space. Agnes paused, the spoon suspended mid-air. "It wasn't built to shake." Sarah offered a strained smile, grateful for the silence. "Before we continue, tell me where you are watching this story from." Agnes served the soup in thick ceramic bowls, lentil and vegetable, robust and steaming hot. She placed the bowls on a low, handmade cedar coffee table, positioning them carefully out of Ethan's easy reach. She did not join them. She stood near the stove, nursing a mug of black coffee, watching the fire. Sarah ate slowly, savoring the warmth that spread through her chilled body. She glanced at Agnes, noting the severe lines around her mouth, the exhaustion beneath her guarded eyes. "David is still outside," Sarah finally said, her voice low. "He insists on trying to secure the garage door. It's futile, I know, but he needs to feel useful." Agnes gave a curt nod. "He'll need coffee, strong and black." "Thank you, Agnes." Ethan finished his soup and then, with the boldness only a child possesses, began exploring the immediate area of the hearth. He discovered a small, slightly dented metal box tucked under a pile of seasoned firewood. He didn't try to open it, he just picked it up, testing its weight. "What's this?" he asked Agnes. She looked down at the box. It contained tools for the stove, lighters, fire starters, and a small coil of thin, strong wire. "That is for starting fires," Agnes replied, her voice flat. "Do not touch the wire." "Why?" "Because it cuts." Ethan gently placed the box back. Then he spotted the birdhouse project on the workbench. He slid off the hearth and approached it, moving cautiously, as if approaching a skittish animal. "Is this a house for a sparrow?" he asked. "It could be," Agnes said, surprised by his curiosity. She had intended the project to be a distraction, something precise, but it had ended up being just another abandoned effort. Ethan traced the outline of a small, decorative window carved into the side. "It's very safe, strong wood." Sarah watched this exchange, a gentle easing in her posture. For weeks, Agnes had been nothing more than the cold neighbor, the eccentric who refused to join the HOA. Now, she was simply the woman with the secure house and the hot soup. The cabin, initially designed to push the world away, had become the only secure point in a violent landscape. It wasn't pity or kindness that bound them. It was the simple, undeniable necessity of shelter. Agnes watched Ethan, the soft focus in his eyes, momentarily replacing the defensive hardness in her own. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was becoming shared, a tenuous peace in the face of the screaming blizzard. Agnes placed the steaming mug of coffee on the counter, ready for David's inevitable arrival. She noticed Ethan had returned to the fireplace, meticulously arranging the split firewood into perfect, geometric stacks. He was seeking order, she realized, trying to rebuild structure in a small way after witnessing the chaotic failure of his own home. She walked to the workbench to retrieve a spare coil of hemp rope. Her hand brushed against the brass compass she kept nearby. She paused, her fingers closing around the cold, metallic weight. The small, familiar pain flared up, sharp and quick behind her ribs. It was the summer she was 10. Her father, a man of endless promises and fewer completions, had given her the compass. "This," he'd said, his voice booming with false authority, "will always show you the way back, Agnes. Always." He'd shown her how the needle worked, explaining magnetic north. Then, he'd left to run an errand at the gas station 3 blocks away. He never returned. Agnes waited for 3 days in the flimsy rented apartment, the compass clutched in her sweaty palm. She didn't call the police or the neighbors. She waited because she believed him. She believed the man who promised direction would be directed back to her. By the 3rd day, the compass had fallen from her grip onto the hard floor, the glass cracking, the needle seizing up in a futile pointing northwest. It was then she understood. The tool wasn't broken. The promise was. There was no way back, only forward, alone. She had spent the subsequent years in various foster homes, always carrying the useless tool, a concrete reminder that reliance was a weakness. Safety wasn't promised, it had to be constructed. A loud, desperate pounding on the door snapped her back. David stumbled in, white with snow, his lips blue. He was physically shaking. Sarah rushed to him, helping him peel off the rigid, iced-over jacket. "The roof is fully open," David gasped, collapsing onto the hearth beside Ethan, who immediately recoiled slightly from the freezing contact. "It's over. We have nothing left upstairs." Agnes silently handed David the coffee. He gripped the mug with trembling hands, not meeting her eyes. The sound of his frantic shivering mirrored the helplessness she felt at 10 years old, watching the snow fall through the apartment window, realizing her shelter had disintegrated without warning. She looked at the sturdy log wall, then at the cracked compass in her hand. The only difference now was that this time her shelter would not fail. The blizzard raged for 3 full days. The initial desperation of David and Sarah gave way to a weary, normalized survival. Agnes's cabin became a fixed point in their world. The routine settled quickly, born of necessity and efficiency. In the mornings, David would venture into the small, covered lean-to where Agnes stored her wood, helping her haul the heavy cedar logs back to the stove. He didn't thank her profusely, he simply worked, recognizing the value of the dry, stacked fuel. Sarah took charge of the domestic space, not out of obligation, but instinctively. She organized the limited pantry supplies Agnes offered, washing the few dishes in the basin by the window. Agnes maintained her distance, but no longer enforced it. She worked constantly, monitoring the structural integrity of the cabin, checking the water lines, and methodically organizing supplies. She never sat to eat with them, preferring to stand near the stove, observing. Ethan was the soft glue binding them. He treated Agnes's cabin not as a temporary refuge, but as an endless puzzle to be solved. He found her half-finished birdhouse and began sorting the tiny, scattered nails into perfect lines by size. When Agnes was measuring logs for the stove, Ethan would hold the loose end of the measuring tape, serious and focused. "You need this end to be very still," she instructed him once. Her voice neutral. Ethan nodded, his small hand pressed against the log. "Like this, Agnes?" She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first time she had acknowledged his usefulness. Sarah watched these interactions, noticing the subtle shift in Agnes. The tension never fully left her, but the fortress walls were lowered, if only a foot. Agnes spoke to Ethan about tools and wood grains, subjects of practical knowledge that demanded focus and reality, never feelings. One evening, David was looking through the thick glass of the small window, staring into the impenetrable whiteout. "We'll have to rebuild everything," he murmured to Sarah. "Start over." Ethan, curled under the wool blanket, looked up at Agnes, who was sharpening a hunting knife nearby. "Agnes," he asked, completely interrupting the adult's anxiety, "why do you have so many canned peaches?" Agnes paused her sharpening, the steel glinting in the firelight. "Because they don't spoil," she answered simply. "Like your house," Ethan concluded, a statement of fact, not a question. Agnes didn't reply, but the knife rested for a moment on the block of wood. The child's simple observation had distilled her entire existence into a single, undeniable truth. Her choice to build slowly and solidly, ridiculed for years, was now the only thing standing. She felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth in the center of her chest, a feeling not of safety, but of being seen accurately, without judgment. For the first time in decades, this quiet space, the hum of the stove, the sight of the boy carefully stacking kindling, felt less like isolation and more like coherence. On the fourth day, the wind eased, reducing its roar to a mournful sigh. The house was finally quiet enough to hold a normal conversation, which proved to be their undoing. The relative calm allowed David's anxiety about the future to finally surface. He was examining the map Agnes kept pinned to her wall, a topographic survey of the local area. "We have to leave as soon as the roads are clear enough," he muttered, pacing the small living space. "We have nothing here. No insurance policy covers this level of destruction." Sarah was folding the thick wool blanket that had been their constant companion. "We need to figure out where we go first. My sister's place, maybe?" Agnes, cleaning the glass of a hurricane lamp, listened in silence. She had assumed their departure, but hearing the certainty of the timeline, the immediate focus on an outside world she had consciously abandoned, brought a sudden, familiar chill. Ethan was working on the birdhouse again, fitting two small pieces of wood together, struggling with the tiny, precise alignment. He looked up at David. "We're going away?" "Yes, buddy," David said, forcing a cheerful tone that sounded brittle. "New house, new school." "But I like this house. It's safe," Ethan insisted, turning to Agnes for confirmation, seeking the assurance he had found in the cedar logs. Agnes kept her gaze on the lamp glass, polishing fiercely. "This is temporary, Ethan," she said, her voice hard and final. "You belong with your parents." David, stressed and emotionally frayed, misread the stiffness in Agnes's demeanor. He saw only the coldness of the outsider he had always believed her to be. "Look, Agnes, we are so grateful for the shelter," David said, his tone shifting from gratitude to defensiveness. "But we don't need lectures on belonging. We are family. We stick together." "Of course you do," Agnes shot back, her voice low and dangerous. She wasn't challenging his love for his family. She was reacting to the implied judgment, the assumption that she, the solitary woman, knew nothing of belonging. "That's what you tell yourselves when you walk away." The phrase hung heavy and toxic in the air. "Walk away." David's face flushed red. "Walk away? What is that supposed to mean? We're going to rebuild our lives." "It means I know what happens when things get difficult," Agnes said, finally lifting her eyes, cold and remote. "You go looking for the next easy structure instead of fixing the one you have." Ethan, startled by the sudden shift in volume and tension, flinched. His small hand holding the unfinished birdhouse tightened. The delicate roof structure he had just fitted together snapped cleanly in half. The sound was small but definitive. Ethan burst into tears, not from pain, but from the shock of the broken object and the adult's sudden animosity. Sarah immediately pulled the boy close. "That's enough, Agnes," Sarah said, her voice shaking with controlled anger. "We appreciate the shelter, but we don't need your cruelty. We'll manage outside until the rescue teams arrive. We've caused you enough trouble." David quickly gathered their few belongings, his eyes burning with hurt pride. Agnes watched them, her posture rigid. She wanted to retract the words, but the deep, old wound had been exposed, and the reflex to push them away was stronger than the newfound connection. They stepped out into the freezing mud and thinning snow, leaving the silence of the cabin heavier and more suffocating than the blizzard itself. Agnes looked down at the broken piece of the birdhouse, a pointless, snapped thing lying at her feet. She had been right all along. Everything breaks, and every person eventually leaves. The immediate silence after their departure was profound. Agnes didn't move for a long time, listening to the cabin settle, listening to the absolute lack of small, necessary sounds. No shuffling blanket, no clinking spoon, no tapping of wood pieces, just the cold, uncompromising integrity of the logs surrounding her. She picked up the 2 broken pieces of the birdhouse. The split was clean, but the connection was irrevocably lost. Her words had been reckless, a weapon aimed at David but hitting the child's trust. "You go looking for the next easy structure." The accusation that her father had earned, she had delivered to a man desperately trying to protect his son. Agnes walked to the window. David, Sarah, and Ethan were struggling through the deep snow, heading toward the splintered remains of their house, a structure now entirely exposed to the elements. They couldn't stay there. The night would bring temperatures far below zero. Their car was inaccessible, buried deep in snow, blocked by the massive fallen maple tree that had trapped everyone in the cul-de-sac. Agnes knew the topography better than anyone. She had surveyed every inch of this land before she built her cabin. She knew there was a barely used utility access road, old and overgrown, running along the ridge behind her property line. It was dangerously steep, but it was the only route out that the tree didn't block. She dropped the birdhouse pieces onto the workbench. Her plan was immediate and purely practical, devoid of sentiment. If they stayed in their ruined house, they wouldn't survive the night. If they tried to walk through the main road, they would face impassable drifts. She had the only access to the utility road. Agnes pulled on her heavy, waterproof gear. She went to the shed, retrieved a massive industrial-grade chainsaw and a coil of heavy tow rope. She didn't call after David and Sarah, knowing they wouldn't accept her help if she offered it verbally. She worked for the next 2 hours in a brutal, solitary silence. The saw roared to life, shattering the peace of the thawing afternoon. She walked the perimeter of her property to the back slope, where the utility road was hidden. The storm had downed several large limbs, making the road impassable even for heavy vehicles. Agnes meticulously cut through the thick wood, the chips flying, her body aching with the effort. She wasn't seeking forgiveness or a reconciliation. She was creating a pathway, a physical, undeniable guarantee that they could escape. Her focus was only on the task, protecting them not through words, but through brute, silent effort. Her transformation wasn't a philosophical realization. It was the simple, arduous choice to ensure that those who relied on her would not find their way back blocked. She cleared the path until the way was open enough for a 4-wheel drive. Then, exhausted, she returned to her cabin, leaving the sawdust and the cleared path as her only statement. Agnes was cleaning the chainsaw, the silence of the cabin broken only by the sharp metallic scrape of the cleaning brush. She did not expect them to return. She expected them to take the path and leave. The knock was hesitant this time, softer than the blizzard-driven panic of 4 days ago. When she opened the door, David stood on the threshold, covered in mud and a fresh layer of snow from digging out their second vehicle, a sturdy old pickup truck he used for work. Sarah stood behind him, holding Ethan's hand. David looked past Agnes, his eyes sweeping over the log walls that had protected them. He didn't offer a clumsy apology for his outburst, nor did he praise her effort. He simply stated the facts. "We saw the clearing," David said, his voice flat with exhaustion and awe. "It's the only way out, Agnes. That utility road has been closed for 15 years. Agnes wiped the grease from her hands onto a rag. "It's clear enough now. Stay to the right." "It took hours of work," Sarah added, looking directly at Agnes. "We heard the saw earlier. Thank you." Agnes shrugged, uncomfortable with the direct acknowledgement. It needed to be done. David shifted his weight. "We're leaving now, headed to Sarah's sister, 30 miles north, but we can't take Ethan's cat. We thought maybe it could stay here until we settle the insurance situation." Agnes looked at Sarah, surprised by the request. It was an offering of deep trust, leaving something vulnerable behind. "It's an outdoor cat," Sarah explained quickly. "It's been hiding under the shed since the storm started. It doesn't like being inside, but it needs food and water." Agnes remembered the scrawny tabby cat, a creature as solitary and tough as the cabin itself, often seen patrolling the perimeter. "I have enough food," she replied. "He won't be in the way." "Uishgud." As David walked back toward the road to retrieve the cat from the remains of his shed, Ethan stepped forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the 2 broken pieces of the birdhouse roof. He held them out to Agnes. "Agnes," he whispered, his eyes earnest, "it's still strong wood. You can fix it. You fix things." Agnes looked at the snapped cedar, then at the small, trusting face. The child saw not a failure, but a temporary problem solvable by her hands. She took the 2 pieces from him, her calloused fingers closing gently around the fragile wood. "I can fix it," she confirmed quietly. Sarah and David watched the exchange. No dramatic hug, no tears, just a physical transaction of trust and repair. The tension dissolved, not into words of forgiveness, but into the quiet, shared understanding of what had just transpired. David returned with the cat, a scarred tabby they named Grizzly, tucked into a worn carrier. They exchanged quick, final nods. As they prepared to drive the battered truck onto the path Agnes had cut, the sound of the engine starting was the sound of safe departure. The sun finally broke through the thinning clouds, casting long, pale light through the cabin's small window. The warm light fell across Agnes's workbench, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The harsh lines of the logs seemed softer now, bathed in the golden hue. Agnes sat down, retrieving her specialized wood glue and clamps. She meticulously worked on the broken birdhouse, aligning the tiny cedar fibers until the roof pieces were perfectly joined. The repair was nearly invisible, stronger than the original connection. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional, a promise kept. The cabin was quiet again, yet it was a different quiet. It held the echoes of 3 other people. On the hearth, the wool blanket was still folded neatly where Sarah had left it. On the counter, a faint coffee stain remained from David's hurried mug, and near the window, the carrier held Grizzly, the tabby cat, who now stared out at the snow-covered yard with an air of settled ownership. Agnes finished the repair, testing the new joint. It held fast. She placed the birdhouse on a high shelf. It wasn't for birds, it was a testament to repair, a small monument to the belief that things broken could be made whole again, not by replacement, but by careful, deliberate mending. She moved to the kitchen and filled a small bowl with water and kibble. She placed the food near the woodpile, under the low shelter of the back overhang where Grizzly preferred to remain. She stepped back inside and closed the heavy oak door. The fortress felt different. It was still structurally impenetrable, but the walls no longer felt designed solely to keep people out. Agnes walked to her chair and picked up the polished brass compass. She looked at the stuck needle pointing perpetually to the northwest. For 40 years, it had been a symbol of betrayal and misdirection. Now, she simply held it, recognizing that while it couldn't tell her where to go, it was a reminder that even useless objects could become valuable markers. She hadn't saved David or Sarah or Ethan. She had merely provided the structure for them to save themselves. And in doing so, she had found that her carefully constructed solitude had room for necessary, practical connection. Family wasn't defined by blood or a roof, but by the choice to stand firm for others when the storm demanded collapse. Agnes looked at the empty space on the hearth, now only warmed by the slow, steady fire. She stood taller than before, the ache in her chest replaced by the weight of responsibility. She knew David and Sarah would return to collect Grizzly, perhaps in a week, perhaps in a month. They had left something behind, not as an afterthought, but as an implicit promise to return to the only structure that hadn't betrayed them. She reached for the cast-iron kettle, ready to start the routine of a woman waiting, not alone, but securely anchored. If this story touched your heart and made you think about the true meaning of belonging, please show your support. Give this video a like. Share your thoughts on the story in the comments below, especially how you define family after watching this, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful, emotionally resonant cinematic stories.